Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Sara Rundell, former member of Faith Assembly. Sara, it's good to have you. We have, Chino and I have explored all things Hobart Freeman and all things Faith Assembly, and we've had either one or two guests now who are from the Faith Assembly cult, and it's interesting to get different perspectives, because what I have found with all of these groups is that the way in which the groupthink works, one person's perspective of the group is entirely different in many cases as another person's perspective. So very glad to get you on here and to share your story. So maybe if you could just, start by telling everybody a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, John. And it's really a pleasure to be here. As so many in the Faith Assembly Church, I grew up in a large family. There are 9 kids in my family, and it can be hard to get a word in edgewise. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have perhaps an hour where I can tell my version of the story here without massive interruptions. So you can imagine what the dinner table was like for the 9 of us and our parents. Yeah, as John said, I actually grew up in the Faith Assembly Church, which is now, of course, commonly referred to as a cult. I was actually basically born into the church. My parents grew up in Massachusetts. My parents were actually heading to California. My dad wanted to attend seminary there. They had heard some of the teachings of Faith Assembly, and they had a friend who attended Faith Assembly. And so they stopped in Indiana to visit the church. And the way my grandmother in Massachusetts told it, all of a sudden she started getting letters from my mother in Indiana. She said, "What's Imelda Kirchhoff, my mother, doing in Indiana? She's supposed to be in California." And I talked to my parents about this later. What happened? What was it about Faith Assembly that interfered with your plans? Because, well, obviously I was supposed to be a California girl, and I ended up being an Indiana girl. And my mother talked about the community and the fellowship that she found in the Faith Assembly Church. I guess initially, before everyone had 8, 9, 10, 12 kids, before things got more and more extreme, it was a gathering of like-minded people who were searching for answers they couldn't find in common society and couldn't find in other church settings. And they would get together, they would break bread, they would have meals, they would share scriptures, they would debate scriptures. So for her, it was very much about community. I asked my dad what he thought. Was it the anointing? What was it that brought you here, drew you here, kept you here? And he said, there was your mother, your older brother, and we just ran out of money. So he stopped and he started working. They stopped in Indiana here, and he started working odd jobs, house painting, factory work, so forth. Now, he had been the first in his family to get a degree, which I think Chino and John, you've talked about how that was a bit unusual in Faith Assembly, and people over time were encouraged to not pursue the education of the world and not pursue even independent thinking at some level. But at that time, when they first joined, and this would have been summer of 1978, I was then born in 1979, there was a heavy emphasis on what seemed like an intellectual life. My father thought he was getting college-level Hebrew and Greek courses and so forth, and would spend hours studying the Greek and Hebrew texts. And so he really thought this was a fantastic way to grow as a minister. He felt called to the ministry, and as a Christian, a baby Christian, newly in his walk with the Lord. Of course, over time, it got increasingly more extreme. One of the main features, John, I know you and Chino have talked about, was this faith healing, which became kind of one of the predominant features of Faith Assembly, and perhaps in many ways its downfall. I was born in a hospital. When I was born in 1979, my parents, I guess, still felt they didn't have quite the light of Faith for Healing. So I was born in a hospital, in Goshen Hospital, in 1979. My parents then had 7 more children, each at home, each without really trained medical attendants. The way it would happen each time is, I was a little kid, and my parents would be saying, "Oh, it's time," and Dad would call. It was one of the sisters from the church, and he would put a big old pot on to boil, and we'd all go to bed. And when I'd wake up in the morning, there'd be a new brother and sister, and this just happened over and over again for many years. My mom had 9 children in 15 years. So that was sort of, that's how it got started. And of course, being born directly into the church, that was the only culture that I knew. This was my everything from the day I was born, that women should wear dresses and you shouldn't have TVs and you shouldn't go to doctors. Jesus is our doctor. Ironically, my dad's degree was in psychology. Of course, shortly after joining Faith Assembly, he tore up his diploma and threw it away because Jesus is our psychologist. And that, that, of course, became the driving theme of so much of our lives.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up. We've had people come on the podcast and they have talked about how the level of community is much more, attractive, I guess you'd say, in some of these cult groups. And I've actually had people who have told me in private, we would leave our cult group, depending on which one it was, we would leave our cult group if not for the community, because we know the moment that we leave, all of our friends and family will instantly cut us off. And so we're staying here, and we don't believe any of it, but we're going to stay anyway. But one of the points that you mentioned, which I don't think anybody really has, is that whenever you're under the indoctrination of a doomsday cult, which these in effect were, the education, there's this need for a human to learn more, and there's a need for education, but they begin to educate themselves on things that aren't relevant to the world, but instead relevant to the cult. Now, I preface that with this caveat. There are a lot of Christians who believe that the study of Hebrew is relevant. But what I'm trying to say is the focus is so heavily emphasized with the cult indoctrination that it's a different type of education of the Hebrew language than, say, what other Christians might have. But anyway, it sounds like you had a large family. You were in this, and what was it like living that life? Did you feel different from other Christians?
Absolutely. And I know, Chinon, you have covered this as well, but there was very much a sense that we only had the light. And that light kept moving and kept getting narrower and narrower over time. And obviously, I was a little child. We attended the so-called mothership through where Hobart Freeman had taught until his death in 1984. We attended there through, I want to say, the late 80s. And then we attended Jeff Barnett's church, Faith Christian Assembly in Acton, for probably 2 or 3 years. And we finished at Tim Neely's church in Goshen. So we attended these various splinter offs over the years. So basically my entire childhood into my teenage years was absolutely in this unique culture, right? And in terms of education, you mentioned that, and I think the Hebrew and Greek kind of fell off over time. It just became whatever Hobart said or whatever the preacher said was just the way it was. And we did not, of course, emphasize education, at least in terms of the way you or I might think of it, or the general American public might think of it. So my mom did try to learn things like, home canning and gardening and sewing her own clothes and those sorts of things. But I think the primary education, quite frankly, was, yes, preparing for the end times, preparing for this idea of immediate obedience, of complete faith, complete mind control, emotional control. So, we were the elect, the end time army of God, and we had to have this sort of mystical, magical connection to God that the general world and certainly other, even very well-intentioned Christians who didn't have the light, didn't have. So that was everything growing up, right? That idea you should always be praying, you should always pray without ceasing, you should always be memorizing scripture, you should always be ready for Jesus to come back any minute. If you talked about the future, if you talked about, spring's just around the corner, if the Lord tarries, everything was if the Lord tarries, because we thought he was coming back any minute. And I absolutely grew up with that, and so that was that. There just wasn't a focus on planning for the future, certainly no insurance or sort of meaningful education or degrees, or even things like, I would have loved to have taken guitar lessons or something. There just wasn't a lot of emphasis on that. There was this idea that if you were going to be good at something, it was the Lord's anointing, the voice of God speaking through you. It wasn't that you could learn a skill, build it up, and explore it over time, get better at it over time. And so our education was, as you might expect, quite minimal, right? I actually homeschooled through the 8th grade. My siblings, most of them were kind of in and out of public school as there were more and more of us. And as we eventually sort of loosened the strings a little, increasingly they were in public school. But I homeschooled through the 8th grade. And my mother had been kicked out of 3 high schools. She was a 60s, 70s hippie, and had eventually gotten a GED. So, she tried to teach me how to read. And then after that, we worked off of self-packs, and a lot of it was just up to us to complete this sort of self-study program, and Mom would send her the tests, and they'd get them back. And we just didn't even bother to do school one year. So that's how little emphasis there was on education, right? So I would babysit my siblings or the neighbor kids sometimes 14, 16, 18 hours a day. And so it just was not. Education was just not a big part of our lives. And then I was going to be a godly wife and mother. So it was more important for me to know how to tend the babies, which is most of what I did, I think, when I was younger, even 7, 8, 10, 12 years old. The educational aspect of it was quite minimal.
Yeah. I laughed and had to laugh whenever you said, "If should the Lord tarry." There are phrases that we said so many times. I can tell you, I still say some of them in my sleep because we said them so often. And that was one that the Branham cult said: "If the Lord tarries, nothing can be in the future far enough, but the Lord might come and take you away." That's how we thought. And our education, I went from cult churches from coast to coast, and there were different varying levels of the education doctrine. Some just outright would not permit it in their churches. Others, it was just, I don't know if I'd use the word forbidden, but it was strongly discouraged. They strongly discouraged education because if the world is going to end tomorrow, why do you need an education? Why would you waste your money on this? Give me, the pastor, your money instead. It was that kind of thing. And so the similarities, whenever I hear people talking from the Freeman cult, it's just mind-boggling. They even right down to the loaded language, we're saying the same things. How did the doomsday aspect of this, if the Lord tarries, the opposite side of that is, what if the Lord doesn't tarry? What if tomorrow is the end of everything? Did that ever affect you in any way as you were growing up in this thing?
I think that was a dominant message. I think we expected Jesus to come back any day, and we were constantly preparing for that, right? And so memorizing the Bible or praying or evidencing your connection to God and your faith by having manifested healings and so forth. That was everything in the church. And then trying to be more holy and more pure. And, women, of course, had to wear the baggy clothes, and you couldn't have TV, and you weren't supposed, over time, increasingly, there was mockery of the media, I think, especially as word started getting out about the deaths in Faith Assembly. And so eventually we weren't really supposed to have magazines, newspapers. Now, I will say, I had friends who grew up in Faith Assembly or branch offs of it who were very limited in what they were permitted to read. And my parents started out doing that with us, but we were voracious readers, my older brother, my sister, and I. And I'll just say, there's also a generational divide in my family. The 3 oldest grew up in Faith Assembly proper. The 3 middle ones kind of overlapped. So they kind of grew up in Faith Assembly and kind of a little more out in the modern world after we left Faith Assembly. And the youngest 3 primarily were educated in public school. Maybe had, by the time they were old enough to remember, maybe we had TV, we were wearing pants, we were more of a worldly family. So it's almost a generational divide. But for the oldest 3, it was Faith Assembly, and increasingly restrictive. And my brother loved to play baseball, and at some point, one of the preachers, I think this was at Tim Neely's church at that point, basically said, you shouldn't be bringing your bats and balls and mitts to church get-togethers. It should be about the Lord, not about things of the world, which was a big difference from when they first started. My dad used to play basketball. They used to play games with the brothers, with the preachers at Faith Assembly early on, and he'll tell you he had to stop playing with someone because he felt like they cheated, but it really got more and more like that. Or even, again, in Tim Neely's church, one of the leaders there started telling people that men couldn't wear T-shirts. They could only wear button-down shirts on Sunday. Or, it just got more and more what they call legalistic. So, if people don't believe what we believe, we say they don't have the light. If they go a little more extreme, then we say they're legalistic. That's kind of how it works in this particular type of group setting.
Yeah, exactly. And it really becomes an us versus them mentality. There aren't physical barriers around the cult, but instead there's this mental barrier. We dress this way, the quote unquote world dresses this other way, or the unbelievers, and they like to emphasize the rules to make people realize that they're different. And I don't know how it was in Faith Assembly, but I know in some of the Branham cult churches, there were even sermons of how we look different. You can tell we're Christians because they look different than us. And so it's this us versus them mentality that grows. And being homeschooled, it's different because you're not around children like this. I was not homeschooled, and so I would be around other kids, and they would be wearing shorts, and I couldn't. And I was allowed to wear some of the T-shirts, but some cult members weren't allowed to wear those. So there was always this mental tug of war that you were playing in your mind. And so you grew up in this, and you had had a lifestyle that was different from the quote unquote world. What would you say was the point where you realized that you were different, than those who weren't part of Faith Assembly?
I think I knew that early on. I know even when it must have been 1983, 84, we moved to a new house, and my dad went over and was talking to a retired couple up the street, and he brought me with him. So they did a thoughtful thing that any grandparent would do. They turned their little TV onto a kid's show and sat me in front of it to entertain this little child while they got to know the new neighbor. When we got home, of course, I had to go through Deliverance. Now, the irony is I couldn't see a darn thing on that TV because I was born extremely nearsighted, negative 6.5, extremely, extremely nearsighted. So my entire life, I had never looked a human in the eyes. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see leaves. I couldn't see my own hand. And I'll actually go on that story there. So after we left the church, I tried to imagine a future for myself, and I had such a hard time doing it. And I told my parents I have to go to public high school. Well, I had never, I didn't know movies. I didn't know pop culture. I didn't know music. I didn't know how to dress the way other people dressed. I went to, I think, Fashion Bug and got a pair of pants that was 70% off. And, that's how I started to try to have normal clothing, normal kind of life in my own way as best I could. But I had to get glasses, and I had saved up money babysitting for my family for 50 cents an hour when they could afford it, and for the neighbor families at $1 an hour. And my mom drove me to the doctors, and she said he looked at her like she was such a child abuser. I couldn't see the expression on his face, but I do remember that when I picked up my first pair of glasses, so I'm about 15, heading into high school here. Again, a little older than most high schoolers because we just didn't do school one year. I'm 15, and I remember walking into the house and putting my hand on the banister to go downstairs and just picking up my hand and just looking at it, like right, left. I couldn't believe how detailed it was, how tiny it was, because I'd only ever seen a blur when I looked down at my own hand. So that was, and growing up that way, all the adults around me, including my father, they had these stories of miraculous healings. So when my parents got to Indiana, my dad had to, of course, get an Indiana license, and he failed the eye test. He'd had glasses, I think, most of his life, if not all his life. As he was driving away, he said, no, I prayed, I believed that I was healed, I am healed. And he went back, he said, I want to retake the eye test. He retook it, and he passed. So he had been miraculously healed. I grew up with those stories, right? And so then there's me, and I am blind as a bat. I cannot read, the McDonald's menu. I have to have my little sister read it for me. And so there was always this idea that there was something wrong with me. Was it some unconfessed sin? Was it some, lack of faith on my part? But I believed. When you're a child, you don't know any better than to believe. I had a dream when I was a kid once that I walked on air. And I woke up in the morning, and I was in the hallway, and I was like, if you have faith and you believe in your heart, So I jumped up in the air thinking I'd be able to walk on air like in my dream. And it didn't happen, but I really believed. So I jumped up again, and it still didn't happen. And I still couldn't walk on air. And so you think, well, but I believed. How is this not working? And it was the same thing for my eyes, right? So that was always and also I had, crooked teeth. My brother had nice straight teeth. Any sort of flaw that you had was a lack of faith on your part. And there's that constant weight of sort of guilt and shame and what's wrong with me, that's just so much a part of your childhood when you grow up in that kind of background.
Right. I'm close to people who were, in the Branham cults. We didn't have the healing doctrines to the same level. People could go to the doctor, they could wear eyeglasses, but there was always this notion that you had stronger faith if you didn't have to. And so people would try to, like, I know this guy, he took the eye test for the driver's license, and he told me he squinted like everything to be able to pass that without his glasses, because he did not want glasses on his driver's license. And the funny part about that is, well, afterwards, you hear the story growing from that into, God healed me and I didn't need them for that eye test. Well, no, man, you squinted and you you compressed your eyeball where it could see differently than you normally could. And things like that, you see both sides of it, and then you start to understand there's a little bit more to this picture than what they're telling me. But I also grew up with people who had chronic illnesses, and it's fortunate, at least in the Branham cults, that you could go to the doctors. But the unfortunate side of it is, the people who had the chronic illnesses, they were indoctrinated to believe that their faith was not strong enough, and it was because they had sin in their lives. And so I can clearly remember one family member in particular just stressing over what on earth had they done. They don't even remember the sin that caused them to be in this chronic illness situation that they had. And they had it the whole rest of their life. I mean, they suffered the whole rest of their life. So things like that, even though it was different with the Hobart Freeman doctrine version of Branhamism, the foundation was the same. It just developed into a more extremist version of it. And all of this, can be traced back to the healing revivals. There were varying levels of that doctrine that were spreading throughout the healing revivals. What was it like whenever you realized that now I can see, if I have glasses, I can see what my hand looks like on both sides. What was it like coming to terms with the fact that now I'm using this medical device, these glasses, when all my life I was told not to? Did that create any awkward scenarios for you where you were trying to take leaps of faith that you didn't normally take?
At that point, I had accepted it, and part of the reason I had was, so we were in Tim Neely's church. I must have been around 13, and my brother broke his arm. The number 4, I guess, in the lineup of children, broke his arm and came downstairs, sort of cradling it, snapped clean out of the socket. So we were a straight-up faith-healing family, 100%. So my sister stepped on a rusty nail when she was little. We prayed for her to be healed. My brother put his arms through plate glass and 4 years old, I think, and cut very, very deeply here, wrapped it, in cloth diapers, and was bleeding through them. He was bleeding so badly. We prayed for him. He still has a nasty, nasty scar, but he was healed. My dad hurt his back and would crawl from his bedroom down the hallway to the bathroom. My dad's 6'2", my big, strong dad, just pulling himself arm over arm, from his bedroom into the bathroom. But he got his healing. That's just how we were. So my brother broke his arm, snapped it clean out of the socket. He must have been, I want to say around 8, give or take. I'd have to kind of go back and do the math a bit. But so we put him on the couch, and Mom did what you do for someone who's got a fever. She made him like chicken noodle soup, and she put a little blanket around him. And he was there for, I want to say, about a week. And everyone in the church kept calling us and saying, the Lord told me, or I had this dream, or, everyone was encouraging us to keep the faith. And he wasn't healed after a week. And my parents, I think my dad came home from work. My mom said, no, we've got to call someone. We've got to do something about this. He's not healed. And I had this absolute faith. Every time we went into that church, I looked at there was kind of a fence, a crosshatch fence behind the pulpit in that little church we were attending, in Tim Neely's church there. And every time I went in there, I was like, this is the day I'm going to see it clearly. Thank you, Jesus. And it just never happened. But anyway, so we're in this church, and we're dealing with this broken arm. My parents actually looked up the OBGYN who'd helped deliver me in Goshen, Indiana. They looked him up in the phone book, and they called him because that was the last time they'd seen a doctor. They had no idea what to do. And he told them, take him to Goshen, let them know he doesn't have his vaccinations. They had to put him in the adult room so he couldn't be around the other children. And we got a cast on his arm, and I think that was kind of the end of the church for us. My parents, I don't think my mom ever went back to Tim Neely's church. I think my dad went back a couple of times, but they had been starting to tell my parents some pretty extreme things. My mom had been married for just a few months when she was a teenager, and her husband had left her. And they basically told her, you've got to leave your husband of 15 years and your 9 kids and go find that guy and remarry him, or your whole family's going to be cursed. It was that kind of thing. So I don't know if it was I kind of thought it was we'd fail the test of faith, would be a simple explanation there. We obviously showed that we didn't belong in that group anymore, but my dad thinks it was more the legalism. My mom just didn't want anything to do with the church after that. So we kind of, at that point, stopped attending church. My family did sort of fall apart for a time, as so often happens when you leave the trauma. My mom had untreated depression for a long time, and she ended up hospitalized in that period with my sister and me, at home taking care of the kids by and large. And we started, wearing pants, and we got a TV. So by the time I got the glasses, it was an incremental step. And it didn't at that point feel so much to me like a failure of my faith. It was just the way it was, the way it needed to be.
You mentioned depression, which is another interesting thing that fascinates me to no end. I know a lot of people who were in the Branham cult that struggled with it. And I also, especially when I was leaving, I went through bouts of depression. But it seems to be widespread among these movements, especially the Doomsday Cult. Were you aware of any other people who were battling depression while you were in it?
I don't know if there were others. I think my mom felt like she was a freak, and everyone acted like she was a freak, because you were supposed to be walking in the light, walking in the joy, refuse to receive bad news. Anything comes along, take no thought, Hobart said. I'm the best one for taking no thought. My wife would be the first to tell you. You're not supposed to think about bad things. Whatsoever is excellent, worthy of praise, think on these, that sort of thing. And so when you had depression, it was some failure in you. Even if you're, given birth to 9 kids in 15 years, you've got no support network, you've got no money, you've got no future, you're being brainwashed and taught to brainwash yourself, deny your feelings, deny your physical bodily needs. It's astonishing everyone wasn't depressed. But of course, in this church group, the solution for that was casting out demons. And so I think part of the reason why we ended up leaving the Faith Assembly proper, I think it was under Steve Hill's leadership at that point in the late 80s. So the brothers told my dad, we gotta cast out this demon. We got to cast out these demons that are plaguing her. And so it was, I think, Jim Trout, maybe Jim Mansfield, Jerry Reeder. Several of the brothers came over to pray for my mom. And we kids were upstairs with Sister Trout. She was kind of keeping an eye on us while they had this prayer session. That we could hear through this vent in our house. We could hear these voices. And they just got louder and louder, praying in their tongues, just like they were almost furious or terrified or something. And the way my dad tells it is, I guess voices started coming out of my mom, almost like different personalities, different people speaking out of her and making all kinds of threats and saying all sorts of terrible things. And we're going to make you so miserable, you won't want to be with her, and just saying these horrible things. And my dad says the brothers went running. They took off, couldn't get out of there fast enough, went running to get away from whatever was really going on here. And I don't recall this part. My dad says after that, my mom was not capable of getting out of bed for weeks or months at a time. She was stuck in bed for a long time after that. So that was the Deliverance story. That's how we dealt with psychological needs. But my goodness, you're right though. How could anyone not be depressed in that type of situation where there's just no positive in any, you've got to keep a happy face. You can't say anything negative. You can't say anything critical. You can't think for yourself. You can't, it's just, how could anyone not be depressed and, dealing with some of that?
Yeah. I don't think it's aired yet, but soon, within the next couple of weeks, it'll come out before this one comes out. Charles and I explore the Deliverance ministries, and we have pieced together, based off of the things that Chino has in his timeline and the things we have with ours, we know where Hobart Freeman went to his deliverance training. And the story that he gives is not quite, the story that Hobart Freeman gives is not quite accurate if you go back and look at it. William Branham, towards the end of his life, started a series of deliverance seminars with Gordon Lindsay, and it appears based on the timeline that that's exactly where Hobart Freeman went. And then from there, it developed into this weird thing where ministers claim to be, I don't know, almost sorcerers or Harry Potter, where they can zap the demons out. I've often thought about going back and just doing a full thorough investigation of how the deliverance notion started, because if you go back into early Pentecostalism, it was about 1907, I think it was 6 or 7. You had F.F. Bosworth, who was William Branham's mentor, and you had John G. Lake, and you had Charles Fox Parham, the founder of Pentecostalism, they started a sect in Zion, Illinois, and the sect did exactly what you're describing, into this hype, into these chanting, got a woman on a table and actually killed the woman. They wanted to straighten her crooked broken bones, or her crooked arthritic bones, and they actually snapped several of them, and it's horrific if you understand the story of what happened there. But then it developed into, none of them went to jail, which was really odd. That's not the only person they killed. But it developed into a theme that entered into Pentecostalism. And what you're describing, it puts the victim into this mental state where they're, almost in a trance. And the things that come out of their mouth, it might seem demonic because they have literally scared the person into a state of euphoria. And it's not a happy euphoria they're in. It's mind-boggling that adults think that this is a good thing to happen, and it's widespread. That's also something that is shared between the Hobart Freeman cult and the Branham cult. Fortunately, I never went through that, and I'm assuming you never had to go through that kind of deliverance, quote unquote, sorcery. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the New Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
I went through Deliverance when I saw the neighbors' TV. In fact, we had some other neighbors later on. Once in a while, this was always a big debate in the family. Once in a while, I was allowed to socialize with the neighbor kids for 1 hour and 1 hour only, because I tempt me into the world, attack my faith, whatever it was, whatever the danger was. But we went over to this house, and it was a mother. Her husband, I think, was a truck driver, so she was there with, I want to say, 3 or 4 children, a couple of whom were around my age. And she would tell the kids, you put on the TV whatever Sara wants, because they can't afford a TV. So she meant it very kindly and very generously. So they put on Smurfs, and I turned the little seat around and stared back at the kitchen, back to the TV. And I didn't know how to explain to her, I can't watch TV. Demons will get inside me. I'll have to have them cast out. And then there was also the incident of Anne of Green Gables. We all read, we were, like I said, we were voracious readers. So we read Anne of Green Gables, the whole series of those books. And at some point at the Faith Christian Assembly level, I guess it came out that the author had dedicated one of her books to some foreign goddess, some goddess or something. And because of that, everyone who read Anne of Green Gables had to go through Deliverance. But it was just my dad. So I didn't have that level of, dare I say, insanity around me where people are screaming in tongues and shaking the room, having a heart attack over this. So it was much, so did I go through Deliverance? Yes. Did it do much good? Perhaps not.
I'm trying to picture being delivered of a Smurf, and it's making all of these funny thoughts in my head.
Well, I didn't have to, because I turned my back on the TV, and that poor woman, she was like, I'm so sorry, is there something else you'd like to watch? And I would try to convert all the neighbors, too. I'd try to, if you have faith, you can have a black plague spit on your hand, because I heard some story about this. Some black plague spit on your hand, and you won't get sick if you have enough faith. And the neighbors just looking at me like, what a strange little child.
Yeah, and that's another interesting point. I can recognize points of time in my childhood where people looked at me and thought, well, that's just really odd. And for me, it wasn't odd, because all of the adults acted this way. All of the children acted this way. But you come in contact with somebody who doesn't know the cult theology and is not indoctrinated, and they think, this is just a little bit weird. And many people, because it's funny to them in some cases, they don't mind saying that. But when you're a child and you come in contact with somebody who thinks you're weird, it's different for a child than an adult. You really want to know, well, why is that weird? Why do you see me differently than yourself? And for an adult in a cult, they see it as pride. They want to think, well, I'm different, and they see me as different, and therefore I'm holy. And it becomes this holy through being different, which is another aspect I don't think many people have talked much about in the podcast that I'm doing. The notion that you can become different from the world and that the world can see you as weird is seen as righteousness in these cults. And I'm assuming, based off of what you said, that matches 100% between Branhamism and Hobart Freeman.
Yes, I believe so. Although, I don't think I ever heard the word or the name William Branham growing up. I think Hobart took everything he might have learned from others and packaged it as God's word to him. Yeah, so I have had no idea of any of these sorts of links. But definitely there was that mindset and almost that arrogance. I just knew that we had the light, we had the word, and if we cared about our neighbors, we had to convert them and get them to accept our version of Christianity and so forth. And so I tried, and I explained to the neighbor girl how she had to wear dresses to church and what have you, because, women shouldn't wear pants. And when you're a child and you grow up in that, that's all you know. Even the retired couple up the street he was a retired pastor, even they didn't have the light. And we should try to share our light with them. And so I try to minister to him. And, this retired pastor up the street from me, I was trying to preach to him about the way Christianity should be and the way the light should be. But it was, I don't think I realized how strange it was until I got probably to high school, right? And I had never looked people in the eyes. I had no idea about music or about pop culture. I think I listened to secular music a couple of times. A neighbor was washing a truck and had a Beatles song blaring on on his boombox there, and I walked by and I was like, well, this doesn't sound so terrible. Is it really such a sin? But I rushed on because I was worried I was sinning listening to that terrible, horrible secular music. So you get out in the world and, people are dressing differently, they're talking differently, they're interacting differently. We weren't supposed to gossip. We weren't supposed to talk about people. So there wasn't that sort of chit-chat. We just didn't have, you're supposed to talk about godly things in the Bible. I didn't know how to interact with humans. I didn't know how to dress. I know I think it was my freshman year in high school, someone came over to the table with a 17 magazine, one of these girly magazines, and it had this actor on the front. And I read it and I said, Keanu Reeves, who is that? And this was the 90s. He was everything in the 90s. And this girl went running from table to table. She doesn't know who Keanu Reeves is. She doesn't know who Keanu Reeves is. She doesn't know who Keanu Reeves is. There was a kid in my biology class. He reached forward and tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, are you a Russian spy? And people asked me where I was from and what country I was from. I had grown up, a few miles away from the high school in Warsaw, Indiana, right up the street. But I had grown up in such a limited world that I had no idea how the world worked. And that was quite the adjustment. And it continued to be. I never looked a human in the eyes before I was 15. I didn't know how to even have a conversation. We didn't do public speaking, didn't do education, there was so much that was missing in all these gaps that I've had to fill. And probably most people who grew up in some version of this cult have to fill. But it gets goofy. It gets funny over time when you look back. She doesn't know who Keanu Reeves is. She doesn't know who Keanu Reeves is. Or even the things like, I still don't know how to swim to this day. And the reason I don't know how to swim, we couldn't dress in those evil, tempting bathing suits. Even as 4 or 5-year-olds, we'd tempt godly men, I guess. So we couldn't wear bathing suits. So the couple times we went to the beach, that haven of evil with all those people wearing their, all those women wearing those tempting clothes. The couple times we went to the beach, I had to wear a long dress. So I either had an air bubble holding me up or a dead weight pulling me down. So is it any wonder I never learned how to swim? Just those kinds of things. You look back and you're like, oh my gosh. But I thought it was true and it was right and I wanted to share it with everybody.
Yeah, we share a lot in common. I remember when I was in, I think I was 16 years old. There was a brother from the church who rented the whole YMCA because he felt so sorry for the children not being able to do the things that other kids do. And so we're all excited. We go. Well, one of the deacons shows up and you women, you have to swim in your long dress. I mean, these are women in jean skirts. These things do not float up like you're describing. They sink. And so all of the girls were having to swim with these heavy, heavy clothes, and the guys had to swim in their blue jeans. And one guy just totally messed his face up during this because he dove in, and it's hard to swim like that. But you're talking about Keanu Reeves. After we escaped and I began to deprogram and started interacting with people, I began to notice things that I never had picked up on about just how different I was from everybody else. The conversations they were having was using pop culture, which I fully did not understand. And it was, their conversations, you had to understand it to understand what they were saying. So I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that during the first, 5 years, 7 years, something like that, I worked from home a lot. I was a consultant. And so I watched the entire collection of TV Land. And I mean, like, the entire thing. I watched every series, every show back to back with the subtitles on so I could hopefully pick up on some things. But even still, today, people will have conversations and I just have no clue what they're talking about because they grew up in a normal world and I grew up in this abnormal world.
Yes, yeah, and that effect lingers for me. Although during COVID, I was working from home quite a bit, so I got to watch, the Top Gun and some of those movies that everyone always referenced, the 70s, 80s westerns and so forth, the Clint Eastwood westerns. Kind of got caught up in some of the Alfred Hitchcock movies. So I've started to sort of fill in some of those gaps in my education. Music as well. My significant other is really into 80s rock, so he's playing all these songs that maybe I've heard, and he's explaining, like, this is so-and-so, and this is Rush, this is Journey, this is whoever it is. I'm like, oh, that's what people are talking about, So some of those gaps are starting to get filled in, but, over time, I think those particular parts of it don't matter as much. I think the hard part, the part that continues to be such a challenge is your standards of how you should be treated and your boundaries were set so far. Like, you were not supposed to be an individual. You were not supposed to speak up. You were supposed to buy completely into this mindset. If you even looked at your parents askance, that was a spirit of rebellion. So your standards for how you should be treated, your boundaries are so far over. Like, you think you're setting good boundaries and have a healthy working relationship or whatever it might be. And eventually you realize, well, I'm kind of being walked all over here. And I don't know how to be any other way. So that's the ongoing challenge, I think, for people who grew up in this. Like, you're so depersonalized or dehumanized, and your expectations of how you should be treated are set so far outside a healthy range. It's hard to reset that, and that's something that I continually revisit, even in my 40s now. And I suspect that's the case of many people who've come out of this group, Faith Assembly, or the William Branham cult, dare I say, or other like groups.
Yeah. It's almost the same across all of the cults. You experience many of the same things, but in different ways. And so from one cult to the next, it seems like it's different because their doctrine may be different, but the framework is actually very similar across them all. And a lot of people who they escape, the things that you and I are talking about, and we can laugh at now because we've been through it, there are other people that don't really understand how to get through it. They struggle to get their head above water, get their footing after leaving a cult. And a lot of them desperately need therapy, and it's a widespread problem that I know a lot of therapists even contact me and they're saying, how do we help? How can you apply therapy to a vast number of people? And there's not really a good way. Since you've left, have you experienced situations where you felt like you needed therapy, or did any of the people who escaped with you, did they have to go through therapy to heal?
Certainly several people in my family. And as you might expect, we've had so many struggles with maybe abusive relationships or addictions and so forth, as people do when they grow up in terrible, terrible trauma, right? And then don't know how to deal with it, don't know how to handle it. And there were definitely a lot of things that happened, certainly in our church, but also in our home, that never should have happened. But I know my mom went through therapy. Some of my siblings have. I certainly have. And in fact, I think when I started at a law firm and was having some relationship problems, I went to a therapist. But I started talking about my childhood. And she essentially just at some point looked at me and said, have you ever thought about having no contact with your family for a while? Because it was that level of, you don't just outgrow it. You don't go beyond it. It's still so much inside you. But I've been through a lot of therapy. I've even done the sort of EMDR for deep trauma. And that's actually what helped the most, I think, to melt that ball of terror and fear that we were all taught to carry around with us to control everything that we said and did. You fall one jot or tittle short and boom, you're cut off from God forever. That's just such a founding premise of these organizations. So I've been through a lot of therapy over the years. And the other thing is just, time and space, right? And then finding your own way in the world and saying, okay, so I had this weird, bizarre background. it creates some goofy stories and some scary stories. It's just my background. Everyone has a background, and no one has a perfect life, a perfect childhood. I think some of those differences kind of maybe not quite even out, but people have different stories at different times in their lives. Maybe it's not a cult, but everyone has struggles. So I think some of those things tend to become just the pressure and the weight of them can ease over time. Therapy certainly helps. And being honest about it certainly helps. And then setting up some kind of different life for yourself, whether it's good relationships, and my siblings have by and large managed to be good parents and good members of society against all odds, or success at work, in my case, I got degrees and I ended up, all right, we're taught not to talk about ourselves, but I'm gonna say this. Okay, so I graduated valedictorian from high school, summa cum laude from college, had a Fulbright fellowship to Morocco, and went to Harvard Law School. So my path in this world came together, not easily, and it took a lot of work and a lot of therapy, but it did come together. And so having those, whatever it is, again, family ties, community ties, work, whatever it is, that gives you meaning in this world outside the cult. If you can find that for yourself over time, I think there is a path to what we might consider a good life.
Yeah. There's a couple points that you mentioned that I'm actually really glad that you did. I don't think these have, so many things you've said have never come up on my podcast before. The EMDR I know has, I know people that has helped significantly. People who struggle especially with PTSD from coming out of a cult. I'm told that it is very highly effective, a really good thing. Mm-hmm. But there's a point that you mentioned that I was hesitant to bring it up. Now that you mentioned it, I can. Whenever you leave one of these cults, your connections into the cult remain, and your healing is so often hindered by your thoughts of the people who are still in the cult. And worse than that, sometimes the people can escape the cult and you're still deeply connected to them, but your connection to them is because of the cult. And therefore, when you're around those people remind you of the cult, and it's really hard to heal. It's like, the open wound scenario where you're constantly rubbing the open wound. Each time you're around this person, it reminds you of your past, and it reminds you of the pain, suffering, etc. And so therapists will often recommend separate for a period of time, let yourself heal, then work with the other people. And it's really difficult because those people, should you separate yourself from them, because of the way they've been indoctrinated, they see this as a threat. Suddenly you're pulling away. And the quote was, in the Branham cults, they went out from us because they were not of us. And they start to get that mindset and, oh no, what have I done? Have I offended that person? But there's a healthy way to do it. You can tell the person, look, I'm going through something severe. This is causing me pain, and it's nothing against you, but my therapist says that I need to separate for a bit, and it's helpful. It would be, same thing if you had a bodily injury, say your leg, and you had you were around a bunch of athletes who like to run. Well, you're no longer able to run. You need to separate yourself. So I'm glad that you brought that up. What would be, beyond that advice, what would you say to people who have left Faith Assembly and who are struggling to find their way? What would you say would be good advice to help them to gain their footing?
If you can find people who've been through some version of it, I've got a friend who grew up Amish, and we've been able to share stories. I've got a friend who grew up in a strict version of Mormonism, right? If you can find people who've been through something similar, they may be more helpful than people who grew up in your cult, or even in people in mainstream churches. Because even, I think I said within my family, there's almost a cultural divide. The youngest children grew up in much more, quote, normal circumstances. We were attending churches that were not Faith Assembly, or Faith Assembly associated. They were in public school. So even talking to them, I find it's hard to explain what the trauma is and what I'm talking about. And so they'll come back with Bible verses or with prayers, or, there's just a sense, even talking to very well-meaning Christians who did not grow up in such extreme circumstances. So to them, the Word of God is a tool for life and health and healing, and not for destruction. So that's where church people tend to go. And you just have to be aware of that and just be honest with yourself. If someone's throwing Bible verses at you when you're hurting in ways that they may not understand, maybe you don't go to that person anymore. And of course, that limits your options of who you can go to. That is a challenge. That's a big challenge, and one that I still deal with. And fortunately, I found people, even people who were not in anything like this, to professors and coworkers, friends who have been kind of supportive and mentoring and helped me kind of talk through things and really appreciated my stories. But yeah, if you can find people who've been through something similar, that's helpful. EMDR, excellent, because there are usually, at least in my case, and I think this is true in many cases, amidst the sort of chronic almost abuse or neglect or gaslighting or the different things that go on in these churches, there are usually a handful of moments that really punch you in the gut. And there were a couple for me. There was one that had me curl up in a ball every time I thought of it. So that's one that I really worked with through EMDR, right? So you can find those moments and work through them. It does take, and I think it's even hard to find good therapists for this kind of thing, because I think the therapists who specialize in religious treatment sometimes want to take a Bible-based approach, and that alone can be traumatic. And I've got siblings who won't set foot in a church, who really haven't dealt with haven't gone to therapy and so forth. It is difficult, I think, even when we sometimes get together as a family, because there are just a lot of things we can't talk about. Yeah. Right? Like, we can't bring it up because I have this perspective that is a little more maybe healed. My sister has this memory of being in this horrible situation. What are we going to do? Attack our parents? Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's just a lot of things I think as a family we don't talk about. And I did have to get away. I went off to France for a year in college. I went off to Morocco for a year. I went off to Massachusetts, went to law school. I lived in Washington, D.C. as a paralegal. I went off to Denver, worked as an attorney there. I came back to Indiana and worked for a few years as an adult. And I was glad that I had that experience, because I had been removed long enough that it was just good to reintroduce myself and re-get to know my siblings as adults and as good people. But yeah, maybe it does take moving away. But I do think you got to be so careful who you reach out to, especially if you've attended a church like that, because you're so used to having someone else tell you what to think and how to act. That it's hard to listen to, and we could call that still small voice. That's religious speak again. It's hard to listen to that voice inside you that says this isn't right for me, or that what this experience or this Bible verse or this prayer, that's not what I need. It takes a lot of work to know yourself, know your own thoughts, know your own feelings, and work through that.
Yeah, it's like you're taking the words out of my mouth before I can get to them. One of the things that I recommend to people, when you have escaped a religious cult and they've literally weaponized the Bible against you. You're under religious, spiritual abuse, and words and phrases they've indoctrinated you with loaded language based off of those words and phrases. Going to a Christian counselor is counterproductive in many, many cases. I actually recommend, when somebody escapes a Christian cult, don't go immediately to Christian counseling. And it's not that Christian counseling is bad, by no means, but it sometimes has the opposite effect of what you're wanting. And sometimes it's better to separate yourself from it for a period of time, and then once you heal, once you're able to hear a Bible verse without it feeling abrasive, then that's the point at which Christian counseling can help. I am one of the people who, immediately after leaving, and gosh, it was probably, 5 or 6 years. If I had have gone to a Christian counselor and they were to mention a Bible verse, it was so abrasive, it would have just sent me into a state of shock. And I couldn't do it. I was shell-shocked. Now I'm healed to the point where I can talk about things like that. But when I left, I couldn't. And a lot of people really struggle with that. So fully agree. Separate yourself from that if you can, and it's all good advice. If you could go back in time and give yourself some advice whenever you were in this religion, and now you've got the insight of an adult who's escaped, what would you tell yourself to help give yourself some encouragement? You're
doing great. You're doing fine. There's this idea that anything you do that falls short is going to cut you off from God permanently. Oh, maybe that's a little exaggerated. You're doing great. You're doing fine. And this isn't forever. There is a world out there. There is a life out there. And there's more to this world. And there are more ways to live a good life than you know. And sometimes you just wish you could go back and give your little miniature self a little hug.
I'm glad that you came on and that you're able to share your story with others and hopefully give some people some help with escaping not only the Freeman cult, but the others. So thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And if there are others who want to talk to someone, it would be my honor and pleasure. I have worked through a lot. I can be a good listening ear. Don't have all the answers. I will not quote verses at you to force you back into a bad situation. I can promise you that. Happy to be a support network for others who might need that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this, and I'm certain that our listeners are going to really enjoy it. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about the dark side of the NAR, you can read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon on Audible.